is a matter little disputed that a rich young man moving into a new neighbourhood is swiftly marked down as lawful prey by all the young ladies of said neighbourhood. Still less is the matter argued that on leasing a fine mansion in the area, such a young man will have a great need of staffing his new house with all manner of maids, cooks, gardeners, and upper servants. A fine young man cannot attend to his own needs, not even a man possessed of 2 sisters. Thus it was that Mrs. Bennet arrived home in a state of the greatest excitement upon receiving the latest item of tittle-tattle from her friend Lady Lucas. Not to the Bennets' former home at Longbourn, of course. That was long since lost, let out at rental in order to support the family after Mr. Bennet's disastrously quixotic tilt upon the exchange. She returned, rather, to a tumble-down and rather disreputable little cottage on the furthest boundary of the village of Longbourn. The Bennet family had settled there after the great crash and readjustment of their financial affairs, and with it their social standing. A dreadful come-down it had been, to be sure. From a landed estate, even if an entailed one, and that a crying shame in itself, to a dwelling once considered fit for a labourer, or at best a smallholder or tenant farmer of small and undemanding family. But the Bennets' brood was not small indeed. 5 girls is a family, a fine family in better circumstances. Only add a son to the pot, and 5 girls might be accounted a fine family indeed, and let the entail go hang. A son might not have cured the Bennets' immediate problems, true. Such a disaster could not be solved merely by production of an heir to the estate. But in the long term, the income from the property would have remained at least in the family hands, staving off penury and guaranteeing them the tattered remnants of gentility. But Mrs. Bennet's room had not obliged, and sonless Mr. Bennet remained. And when he was gone, so would the money from the estate rents evaporate, and with it all means of support for Mrs. Bennet and her girls. A sad world, a sad, sordid world indeed, and money the implacable engine driving it. And indeed the same implacable engine driving Mrs. Bennet, as she flung the creaking cottage gate open, and hurried down the garden path. Around the back of the house, and through the kitchen garden she wended her way. The garden was planted to within an inch of its life, with everything edible, medicinal, and useful that might be imagined, and the chickens were pecking about in it to find wormy and spidery sustenance, as they might, hot mash being a luxury now rarely accorded them. All of that went to the old pig being fattened up in the tiny field attached to the cottage. In better times she might have encountered Peggy, the family's last remaining servitor, hanging out laundry or picking time for a toddy for Mr. Bennet. One last servant, the Bennets' last thread of a claim to being merely gentlefolk in somewhat reduced circumstances, not finally and irrevocably descended into the petty bourgeoisie, or still worse, the peasantry. But Peggy's mother had fallen sick these 3 months past. After posting off to take care of her, Peggy had finally sent word to say that she wouldn't be returning, and who could have blamed the faithful old girl? The stipend the Bennets had been able to spare her had been lean indeed these past few years. This defection had been followed by earnest debate. Could they afford to take on a new housemaid? And the final verdict being, despite Mrs. Bennet's mutinous and unruly protests, that most certainly they could not. Servantless they were left, bereft, denuded of assistance in keeping the household ticking over, and quite without a pretension to gentility left in the world. An ordinary working family indeed, lacking only the remunerative work that would have confirmed their status finally. Urgency is a thing that can clarify the mind to a wonderful degree, and certainly for Mrs. Bennet, this final buffeting thump in the Bennet family's downward descent in social status had made something clear. For a fair few years now she had been in a condition of indignant denial, refusing to admit the seriousness of their financial affairs' deterioration, or the necessity of examining efficacious but disagreeable solutions. But now, and over the past few days, Mrs. Bennet was a changed woman. No possible solution was too outre for her consideration, and anything bringing in money to the household was worth considering as a solution. True, they were not indigent, as yet, Mr. Bennet lived and breathed, and the entail was not yet a matter monstrously looming upon their doorstep. And yet 5 daughters, a number that might make a strong man blench, and a nervy fuss-spot of a woman near to go off her head when it comes to thinking of how to raise them and support them. The clothes, the food, the education. For the Bennets' slide down the social ladder had been gradual, barring the last disastrous bump. Many had been the expensive music lessons shelled out for, the Italian master or highly recommended governess hired along the way. One never knew what accomplishment might prove to be crucial in securing the attentions and addresses of an eligible parti. But now, for the first time, marriage was not the foremost matter in Mrs. Bennet's mind in relation to her girls. For sure, if one or more of them could procure a solvent suitor, it would be a great blessing. But the matter of their immediate outgoings was too pressing, the lack of long-term financial security too inarguable for marriage to be relied upon as an answer. It was too chancy, too much subject to the winds of fate. More certain means of securing funds were necessary. Raising more livestock, perhaps? Or turning their few sinewy, underfed bantams into a thriving pot, fowl and egg business. Mary, indeed, as the most expensively educated of the girls, finally allowing the Bennets to reap a return on their investment by searching out employment as governess or village school teacher. Such prime appointments did not make themselves available on a regular basis, however, and more humble, less remunerative positions must be considered in the meantime. Anything even vaguely resembling respectable paid employment, in fact, was liable at this point to be seriously entertained by Mrs. Bennet. Beggars couldn't be choosers, after all, and, while not precisely beggars as yet, drastic measures must yet be taken to prevent their ever entering upon that penurious and precarious state. It was a peculiarly focused and energetic Mrs. Bennet, then, who hustled chickens out of her way, en route to the kitchen door, and impatiently brushed drying herbs aside as she entered the cottage kitchen. The sight that met her eyes there was of her 3 elder daughters, each occupied in her own way. Mary was working upon a text with the aid of a Greek primer at the kitchen table, a less idle and unprofitable pastime than it might at first seem, since the vicar of the parish had made a project of a learned and scholarly archaic work of philosophy, and was sometimes of a mind to pay Mary a few shillings for correcting and refining his work, and making her own suggestions for editing and further expansions upon the theme. Jane, dear and lovely Jane, a smile always upon her sweet lips, even in their straitened circumstances, was sewing by the fireplace. A shawl about her shoulders, for they could not afford a roaring blaze early in the autumn, when an extra layer or 2 might do the job instead. Jane was a fine and accomplished seamstress, and in times gone by the work in her hands might have been an elaborate sampler, or a bonnet fit for the head of a lady of fashion. Today she was darning stockings. A great pile of them dropped one by one as they were completed into the cotton laundry bag beside her, and some of them being stitched at for the 3rd or 4th time, lumpy with reworkings. Waste not, want not. Lizzie, that's much too thick. You're throwing half the turnips away, Mrs. Bennet said sharply. These, her first words upon stepping through the doorway, were directed at her second daughter, for Elizabeth Bennet, second child of moderately educated, formerly well-to-do gentlefolk, was standing at the kitchen table, with her dress sleeves pushed up high, her hair pulled back, and her face a little pinkened. She was engaged in peeling a great pile of root vegetables for the evening stew, a set of pastry pie cases set out on the marble rolling board beside her. Her forearms worked with the labour of it, still quite narrow and pale, a gentlewoman's limbs, but not quite as narrow and pale as they had been the year before, and still less the year before that, and her gown plain and serviceable besides. Both her arms and her face were a little browned, in fact, from working out in the garden, and feeding the pig in the field. She had acquired a little heft, a little muscle doing it, and while not unbecoming, it was also not quite ladylike. In short, if any guest, upon setting foot in the kitchen, had been introduced to Elizabeth as the family serving girl, he would have let it pass without comment. She could still pass for a lady, certainly, and yet the matter was by no means a foregone conclusion. In any case, there are worse tragedies in the world, and while not smiling, there was humour in her face as she replied to her mother, "Fear not, ma'am. At least Hogberta the pig will eat well to-night." And she pressed on with her labour, as her mother huffed and puffed and set down various packages, not pleased in the least by her daughter's wit. "Will you take a dish of tea, mother?" Jane tactfully interjected, setting the kettle on to boil over the fire. And Mary bestirred herself to find Mrs. Bennet's comfortable stockings and slippers, for truly no one in the house could be comfortable and at liberty if Mrs. Bennet was not. Finally, the chatelaine of the house was established in a greater degree of comfort and a better humour, a dish of tea on her lap as she took over Jane's seat by the fire, and she pushed back her mob cap, letting her now scanty hair fall free as she gazed upon the fruit of her womb with almost a smile upon her face. "Well, girls, that is much better indeed. I thank you most kindly. Why, what a number of stockings you have mended, Jane. A labour of Hercules, indeed. And Mary, I only hope that his reverence truly appreciates your scholarship with all the work you do for him. Lizzie," she added, nodding to Elizabeth, "I am sure the vegetables will be well enough. I hope you have not forgotten the onion in the pies. You know how I appreciate my onions." "I must warn our father to refrain from the marital bedchamber to-night," Elizabeth murmured. Not audibly to Mrs. Bennet, however, who prattled on, almost oblivious. "Your father, Lizzie? Where is he, in any case? And your sisters, too? Do not become lax in your duty, and cease to keep a close regard upon their doings. We do not want them to be falling into wild village-girl ways. No mannerless hoydens shall be raised up in this house, let it be noted." "Our father is in the study, ma'am," Jane replied sedately, buttering Mrs. Bennet a tea-cake and serving it up. For the cottage did possess a study, or so they named it, a little box-room with a shelf of books, a desk, and a small thick-glassed leaded window with a limited view of the garden and field. Here he could watch over his family's labours, and occasionally join in them, although this was a rare occurrence. "And the girls have gone to help Mrs. Long pick apples and berries. She promised to lend them the pony to come home, taking turns to ride." "Well, I hope she does not work them to the bone," Mrs. Bennet sniffed. "Really, the woman oversteps the mark sometimes, asking one favour upon another." This was a notably convenient observation, forgetting that Mrs. Long always paid Kitty and Lydia for the little jobs around house and garden that she had them do, that it was often more a question of a kindness done the Bennets rather than a favour asked of them, not to mention that, knowing Lydia at least, as much fruit was liable to be eaten as ever got picked. "And now, girls," Mrs. Bennet said, taking a hearty slurp at her tea and twinkling at them as one who has an exciting secret to share, "your mother has some very exciting news for you." Setting her tea down, she drummed her fingers together and gazed at them expectantly. But it was a rare day that their mother did not have exciting news of one kind or another for them, and perhaps their reaction was less enthusiastic than someone with an exciting story to tell might wish for. Mrs. Bennet huffed a little, and tsked a moment too, but in the end the desire to tell her tale could not be resisted, and overcame any wounded feeling over the lack of receptivity of her audience. "Well," she declaimed, giving them all a meaning look around, like the narrator in a play, likely to reduce them to tears, awe, and the most ribald laughter. "I doubt that any of you have had reason to speak to Lady Lucas more recently than I have myself, Indeed, it was a matter most unlikely, for Lady Lucas was a being from quite another sphere of life than the Bennets now. It had not always been so. Indeed, there had been a time when Mrs. Bennet considered her dear friend Lady Lucas just a tiny bit below her in terms of social station, her money being from trade, or rather Sir William's, whereas the Bennets came from a long line of respectable gentlefolk. Not that even one so lacking in tact as Mrs. Bennet would have often said as much out loud. And yet she had nursed and cherished a comfortable feeling of slight superiority to her friend, surely one of the great comforts and most fulfilling pastimes of any lady of advancing years and unsatisfactory marriage. Now things were much otherwise, and although Lady Lucas had not altogether abandoned her friends of former days, now that their circumstances were so much reduced, their position in life sadly degraded, still she could not make the realities of country society other than they were. Such realities being those dictating that a man of comfortable fortune, even of fortune deriving from trade, could not be seen to live in close congress with the family of a feckless minor country gentleman who had succeeded in spendthrifting and gambling away what small personal funds he still possessed. If the gambling be in business matters, and conducted upon the exchange, it added little in the way of respectability to the matter. The Lucases had not dropped the Bennets after their misfortune and forced removal from Longbourn, not precisely dropped them. There were still pleasantries exchanged at church on Sundays, gifts from the Lucases' estate at Christmas and Whitsuntide. If a member of the Lucas clan should encounter a Bennet in the street in Meryton, then very kindly inquiries after their health and well-being would follow, and that of their family, without intentional condescension. But things were not as they had been. How could they very well be? It was a sorrow to Miss Elizabeth Bennet, her sisters knew, for she had at one time stood almost as a sister to Charlotte Lucas, and they had still a great affection the one for the other, even if from a much greater social distance. Mrs. Bennet, however, did not grieve. This fact might have been due to her lesser, more tepid affection for Lady Lucas, compared to Elizabeth's friendship with Charlotte Lucas. More likely, her daughters felt, that it was due simply to a complete refusal to accept the consequences of the Bennets' fall from grace. But in some secret portion of her heart she knew that her family no longer operated on any terms of equality with the Lucases. Otherwise, why her triumph on each occasion that she encountered Lady Lucas, and could point to some mark of undue favour or regard to prove otherwise? Half her air of victory and remonstrating superior wisdom now might have derived from this aspect, but there was more to it, as she proved. "Well, my dears," she continued, "then you are not very likely to know the latest news of the newcomers to Meryton, for Lady Lucas has been most intimately involved in the letting of Netherfield Hall. 'Tis the same letting agent who sold the family Lucas Lodge, you know, and he's a very good fellow, who has kept her informed upon every last detail. Well, in any case, no one is better informed upon the subject than Lady Lucas, and thus myself also." And now she set her dish of tea away from her, and sat with her hands folded upon her stomach, as one pregnant with news. "Netherfield is let, then?" Mary asked, with a prosaic lack of excitement. "That is a deal of good news for the neighbourhood. Local merchants may do well out of the business, if the new occupants decide to do the house over in the latest style. And closer to home, if they have any children of an educable age, then perhaps I might propose my services as tutor, and bring in an appreciable sum from such a prosperous family as they must be." Her eyes glinted like a mild-mannered owl from behind her pince-nez, as she visibly turned the idea over in her head, and seemed to derive some satisfaction from it. "Why, Mary, I will thank you not to steal the words out of my mouth, and make my announcements for me," her mother exclaimed, a little snappy and pettish in her irritation, and seemingly forgetting that she had already let slip the bare bones of the case, not ever having had the knack of effectively telling a tale, no matter how many of them she might spin over the years. "But yes," she confirmed, with leaden emphasis, "Netherfield Hall is let. But to no purpose to a blue-stocking such as yourself, Mary," she hastened to add. With a little purse of her already tight mouth, she gathered herself a moment, before saying, "If you must know, Mary, the fact is that Netherfield is let to a single gentleman, and although I believe he has intentions of bringing 2 sisters with him to keep house, according to Lady Lucas there are no children in the case at all, although one of the ladies is married. A great pity for you, Mary, although one never knows. The married couple may remedy the issue at some future point, who can say? But to rely on any union being blessed with fruit is a chancy thing, I fear," she added, with a melancholy air. This was deflating news for all present. The elder Bennet girls were sensible and wise enough to the ways of the world that their parents saw no reason to hide the seriousness of the family's predicament from them, and had long since ceased to maintain even the most flimsy pretence. Elizabeth patted Mary's shoulder as she passed by, on her way to fill the great kitchen pot with water for stew, and even Jane's usually serene, beatific countenance was a little dimmed. "However," Mrs. Bennet continued, a little smugly, "I see no reason to despair, for Lady Lucas, being well acquainted with the lettings agent in the case, is well informed upon the matter. 'Tis true the young man concerned will have no need of a governess or tutors for growing sprigs, but Lady Lucas tells me that he does not intend to bring a full staff from his former residence in the north. Apparently it was much too small for he and his sister's needs, and understaffed besides. No, instead he wishes Mr. Briggs, the letting agent, to hire a great many members of staff of all kinds upon his own recognizance." And with this Mrs. Bennet folded her arms, and smiled down at the small autumnal fire in the grate, with a look of the greatest satisfaction upon her face. The pause in conversation that followed was of a good minute or two's duration. It was only interrupted by Elizabeth pumping away at the water butt to fill the kitchen pot. This she did with the most prosaic air in the world, since she rarely found it profitable or diverting to provide an eager audience for her mother. Jane, however, was not made of quite such stern stuff, and, giving way to her own puzzlement, she charged their mother thus: "But, ma'am, I fear I do not understand. To be sure, it is a great shame that the new occupant has no offspring. 'Twould be an ideal position for Mary, such a scholar as she is, so perfectly fitted to fulfil the highly advanced requirements of governess or tutor in the highest households in the county. But if such is not to be the case, ma'am, then what can the workaday roles that Netherfield Hall servantry might require concern us?" Mrs. Bennet had taken to chewing, a trifle gummily, upon her tea-cake. Since she had borne 5 children, and lost another, and teeth were a resource her mouth found to be in short supply, therefore. A moment or two thus passed, before she was in a position to swallow and to reply. But when she did so, it was with the greatest tranquillity in the world. "Why, Jane," she said, looking only a trifle bemused, "do not you know that I have it in mind to put Lizzie's name forward to become one of the maids at Netherfield Hall?" At a later period in the evening, much more had transpired, matters taking several hours to settle down and give way to a relative calm. Only relative, for at this hour Jane Bennet was to be found in the attics of the Bennet family cottage, pacing up and down the cramped little bedroom she shared with her sister Elizabeth. Her face was apple red in the cheeks, her hair in disarray, and over all she had an air of discomposure, no, still more than that, going as far as to seem actually het up and incredulous. "Lizzie, I do not know how you can be so calm," she expostulated now. She glanced down at Elizabeth as she spoke. Elizabeth was reclined upon the narrow little cot that served her as a bed, and brushing her hair in a methodical fashion. It was true to say that she was the very picture of composure to the casual observer, Although if Jane had perhaps been less up in the air herself, she might have seen that for all her apparent serenity, Elizabeth's cheeks were a little pink, her eyes too bright, and her jaw just tight enough to notice. But her voice was very steady when she replied, "I do not see that there is any reason to be flying up in the air, Jane. You know as well as I do the situation we are in, and how bad it is. Our mother has assessed our circumstances, and I cannot say she overstates the case. Now an opportunity has come our way, and she wishes that we grab it with both hands. Is that so hard to understand?" And Jane's beautiful, marmoreally lovely face had, at this moment, the look of a pig's bladder, blown up and about to burst. "But it is so unfair," she cried out now. "She does not suggest Lydia, you notice, who is, let us speak plainly, her favourite. She does not suggest Kitty, who is a meek little thing, and would not say boo to a goose," Elizabeth said dryly. She put down her hairbrush and took up a book from her bedside cabinet, but she could not maintain the pretence of leafing through it for more than a few seconds. She smiled at Jane. Kitty is a housemaid. She would spend the whole week weeping and praying for her afternoon off. She would break a great deal of china and annoy the cook, and, in short, be let go within the month. And where would be the good in that? "Well, why not Mary, then?" Jane demanded, stood in the middle of the room with her hands on her hips. It was an unwontedly martial pose for Jane. She was truly a magnificent creature, with her gold hair flowing down her back, her arms bare to the cool evening air where the attic porthole was opened. Elizabeth scrutinised her thoughtfully, and perhaps for the first time, more as one appraising a valuable family asset than one regarding a beloved sister. "Mary will not do," Elizabeth said firmly. "Her education has cost too much. I could not even begin to calculate the investment in guineas spent. The waste would be tremendous. It may take a deal of time to find her an appropriate position, but it is better to wait, and in the meantime everything costs money, and at least one of us must earn it." "Oh, you are so horribly practical," Jane expostulated again. She looked and sounded very near to crying. She stood there for a moment or two, a positively wild Maynard, and the attic air was pregnant indeed. "Well, it should be me then," she burst out finally. "If it must be one of us older ones, because we have more sense and more household craft, then why not? I have near as much sense as you, Lizzie." And her eyes dared her sister to argue the point. "And I am at least as much use as a cook, and a better needlewoman, and I can knit besides. And I have a more cheerful disposition. I would not be coming home crying on Sundays." This last might have been true, but she was decidedly crying now. And Elizabeth succumbed, and leapt up to embrace her sister, wiping away her tears and smoothing her hair. Her words were affectionate, but firm. "Nonsense. Jane, my love, you know quite well it is so." There was a mulish mutter from Jane herself, and a strangled sob, but this did not at all deter Elizabeth. "Yes, you do. And for why? Let me spell it out to you. You are the most beautiful girl in Meryton, Jane, and quite possibly the most beautiful girl in Hertfordshire. That is a very pleasant thing for any girl. But in our current straits it may be more than that. Your face may be your fortune, Jane, and our family's fortune also. You are the best of our family's chances, horridly mercenary as it may sound." Jane pulled away a little, and would not look Elizabeth in the eye. "Well, and what of it?" she answered, in an argumentative tone. "I suppose serving girls marry every day of the week, do they not? At least as much as fine ladies." And Elizabeth watched her, with something a trace unsympathetic in her gaze. "Oh, indeed they do, Jane dearest. But they do not marry advantageously. They do not marry gentlemen, as a rule, nor even honest men of trade with thriving businesses. They wed grooms, and serving men, and farm labourers, and by God, I'll not see your face wasted upon one of them." There was some violence in her voice at the last words, not to speak of taking the Lord's name in vain. It stilled Jane, and stopped her tears. She gazed at Elizabeth with open incredulity. Elizabeth, who looked back at her with a softened regard, put an arm about her shoulders, and pulled her down to sit upon the cot. They both breathed a little heavily for a moment, and Jane wiped her eyes once more. After a moment she spoke. "Lizzie, you sound so—" she said, but she could say no more. "Hard," Elizabeth suggested. "Mercenary? Cold? Calculating?" She relented a little, and patted Jane's hand. "No doubt. All of these years that I have made mock of our mother, and criticised her desperation to maintain our station in life, preferably by marrying us off to landed gentlemen. Well, it serves me gladly, I suppose, now that I have come around to her manner of thinking. Pounds, shillings, and pence, these are what rule the world, Jane. And you may blush and avert your eyes as you please, it is still the truth." It was a little playful, but then her face became more serious, and she turned Jane's face to look at her with one finger to her chin. "Indeed, but I mean what I say, dear sister. To waste your face upon a man of the soil, or a serving fellow, a footman, or a humble private in the army, to live in poverty, 'twould be criminal." "Full many a flower is born to blush unseen," Jane began, but Elizabeth waved her words away impatiently. "Oh yes, very true, a very pretty thought, my love. But I think you will also find that there are many comfortably settled gentlemen and prosperous tradesmen with good hearts and kindly natures. For the sake of our sisters, as much as our parents, would it not serve better for us to find you one of these? And Jane, if once we allowed you to serve as maid in a great house, any such possibility would be gone. No gentleman would look your way, or not with honourable intent, certainly. And you'd have little better chance in trade, where men prefer the demure daughters and sisters of their colleagues and friends, or the second and third daughters of minor titled men. Only your beauty and your technical status as a lady would still recommend you. These are your valuables, your credit in the world, and you must stick to them at all costs. You cannot go be a serving girl in a great house, Jane, not if we were down to our last farthing. It would be the ruin of all your chances." "And that is exactly why it is so unfair," Jane railed, loud enough to carry out into the night. She jumped up, away from Elizabeth, with her arms up about her ears, and she fled to the furthest corner of the room, not so very far at all, and rested her forehead against the plaster of the doorway. But there was something of defeat in the swan-like dip of her pretty neck, even as she turned around and made the last stand. She put her hands out in plea as she said persuasively, "What of your chances, Lizzie? What of your reputation, your status as a lady, as our father's daughter? What about—" she hesitated. "Your chances of marriage? Marriage to a good man, a nice, respectably well-off, gentlemanly fellow, who would be so very fortunate to find you. Lizzie, what about you?" Her sister, however, remained sadly unimpressed. She shrugged markedly and said, "Well, what of me? I am a nice-looking girl, Jane. I have very little modesty, and do not value myself low. Nice-looking, but not such a beauty as you. And quite a quick study, if you ask our father, but not half so brilliant and adept as Mary. I am principled, mostly, and kind to those I like, but I may lack something of Lydia's warmth and ready sweetness that may yet catch her husband before I ever shall manage it. If she does not ruin herself with some lad from the village first," Jane muttered, in a most uncharacteristic fit of rebellion and lack of charity. "If she does not do that," Elizabeth agreed gently. "And Kitty, well, as I say, Kitty simply would not survive being in service. She has not the grit for it, and certainly not the sense. And so, dear Jane, it comes down to me. I am not a good bet for the marriage mart. Not comely enough, too quick-tempered, not sufficiently adept at pleasing. But I would make an excellent maid. I can already run this household better than our mother. I can flatter the butcher for a better cut of meat, if convincing sincerity is not required. I am not too proud for menial tasks, and I would always sooner laugh at the world than cry over my sorrows. In short, I am the best choice. Which of us could do it better? It is still unfair, Jane said, stubborn. She cried no longer, but her eyes were still red. Oh, you reason it out very well, Lizzie, but our mother is all partiality. There is no reason involved in her choice of you. I have never been her favourite, Elizabeth agreed, quite sanguine. Nor she mine. But you do her a disservice, Jane, and are a little unjust yourself. She is a mother by instinct, and would fight the world for her children's advantage, mine included. If she has not thought through all the reasons why I must be the one to volunteer, yet she knows it at heart, bypassing reason. I am the one who can survive it, with a smile on my face. I will do very well, Jane darling. Do I not make myself at home and adapt to any situation, much like a cat? Volunteer? Jane asked, her pretty sloping shoulders sagging now a little. What is there voluntary in this? You are compelled by duty, conscripted by our mother. But Elizabeth was across the room, and put a finger to Jane's full rose-petal lips. No, our mother would not force me to it. Well, in truth, Jane, she could not force me to it. After 5 children and 45 years, she has not the strength to drag me kicking and screaming, even if they would take me under such conditions, under duress. But I will go in any case, and freely. Jane, it will not be so bad. See, you must be a very fine lady, to think it will be so bad. And what about your chances, Lizzie? What about marriage and children? Jane said heavily. Who will marry you if you give up your position in the world? Oh, Elizabeth said pertly, as you say, sister. Serving maids get married every day. I shall wed, a farmer, or perhaps a butler. Butlers are very grand. If I marry a butler, I shall possibly become too inflated with my own self-importance to even talk to you. Or a sailor, a soldier. Who knows? There are a great many men in the world, and I do not doubt that there exists one foolish enough to take me as a bride. Oh! Jane embraced her sister, had given in, at least for this first round. For the world is a hard place, and the realities of it tend to be very real. But a sister's a sister, for all that. End of Volume 1 of A Maid at Pemberley.